All right, to be completely honest with you, this is about the 18th time I've attempted to record this intro. Something keeps happening every time I try. Someone knocks on the door, the phone rings, a text message goes off, I forget what the fuck I'm saying. But here we are, last chance. Welcome to Crudely Drawn Conclusions with David and Mike. Now, in this episode, we did sit down with a Navy SEAL, not a former Navy SEAL, because there's no such thing as a former Navy SEAL, but a Navy SEAL by the name of Ben Milligan. Now, Ben Milligan is actually a pretty intense, pretty in-depth historian. He sat down for 8 years, for 8 fucking years, and he wrote a book, By Water Beneath the Walls. It's a true story. It's a impeccably well-researched story of the history of the Navy SEALs. So if you're into that sort of thing, or if you're not into that sort of thing, I don't really give a shit. Take your ass on over to Amazon.com right now. Log in, if you're not automatically logged in. Type in Ben Milligan. Type in By Water Beneath the Walls. And you'll find that book and order it. Read it. This guy put a lot of passion, a lot of pain into this book. And I hope it does well for him. And for whatever we can do to actually help him, that's what we're going to do here. We had a lovely conversation with a trained professional killer. Now, I've had a couple lovely conversations with a couple of trained killers. Not trained, but killers nonetheless in my lifetime. The last one was my uncle, right before Ben. Now, Ben's an articulate guy. Ben's a nice guy. Ben's a professional guy. Ben's a patriot. Ben's been deployed all over the world to help defend our democracy, to do the things that he was supposed to do. Now, my uncle, he just killed people. A couple people. Not that many, probably not as many as Ben, because Ben is more highly trained and, had a larger selection and didn't have to hide the bodies. But when I'd sit down and I would talk to my uncle, he would mostly gloss over the gory details, instead speaking of hookers and Matamoros and the good times with methamphetamines. And he didn't really bring up all the details that would be involved with the actual murdering of people. Now, Ben, murder's not the right word for Ben. Of course not. Ben was a soldier. Ben was a special forces operative. But we're splitting hairs here. Ben's a nice guy, and I hope his book does really well. It was an honor and a privilege to talk to him for the better part of an hour. Now, as always, on Crudely Drawn Conclusions, if you could just head on over to Cup of Joe, put in Crudely Drawn Conclusions there, and give David Chapman $5, we would both appreciate it. Now, I actually am going to go the extra mile here and put the link to that in the show notes, so you can just click it, give the money, and we'll send you a coffee cup or something like that. Nobody rides for free with Crudely Drawn Conclusions. But anyway, as long as we're speaking here, I just want you to take now about 28 seconds and listen to the little theme music by Kid Quill, and then after that, a young David Chapman.
No top hits, neighbors think it's obnoxious. I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson, but damn, you gon' have to wait until the drop hits. I forgot to take my vitamins, but didn't forget to smoke.
Hey, all right, well, welcome to another Crudely Drawn Conclusions with David and Mike, and today we're joined by Ben Milligan, who wrote the book By Water Beneath the Walls. He's a former Navy SEAL, and we appreciate him joining us today. How you doing, Ben?
Good. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mike.
No, thank you, man. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Happy.
Yeah. So, like I mentioned before we started recording, I got a good way through the book. As somebody who didn't serve, I found it really, really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, just like right off the bat, in one of the early chapters, you kind of talk about you had just gotten back from Iraq, and I think you were having a conversation with your grandmother, and she asked you, "I thought you were in the Navy. What are you doing in Iraq?" And could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the question that she asked, and I think it was a fair question, was, what the hell were you doing in Iraq? And she knew that I was in the Navy, and she wasn't completely sure what a SEAL was. I think until the day she died, she thought that a SEAL was something akin to a rescue swimmer, but she wasn't completely without context. She lived through World War II. She was the oldest of 7 kids. She had 6 younger siblings, and all of her brothers had served in the Navy in World War II, and she knew what they did, and only one of them had ever gone ashore, and it was almost by accident. So I mean, she had a fair question, and I didn't have a good answer. So what was I doing there? And the my response was, I'm a SEAL. I'm not a sailor, and it didn't satisfy her curiosity, and when I thought about it, it didn't satisfy mine either. I had no idea, and the more I started to think about it, and the more I started to actually read, I got the sense that nobody else really knew the answer either. So
I get the sense about that a lot of things these days.
yeah, right. I mean, we have a weird national security infrastructure. I mean, we essentially have 3 separate air forces. The Army Air Force, the Navy's Air Force, the Marine Corps' Air Force. We have 2 separate armies. We've got the U.S. Army, we've got the U.S. Marine Corps. We've got 2 separate navies. We've got the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard. And one of our armies works for one of our navies.
Right.
So it's just sort of, it's a weird sort of makeup. If you had to, build the U.S. the military for the United States of America from scratch today, you wouldn't build the infrastructure that we have. It just sort of has evolved in weird ways. So we have, knowing that, we've grown up and we've seen, we've watched the news all of our lives, and we've just sort of gotten used to weird things being associated with our military or branches of service that are supposed to do one thing, but they also do something completely different. So I think there's probably lots of different books that you could write about if you ask the same question, like whether what the hell is the Marine Corps doing in central Iraq or central Afghanistan. That could probably be just as interesting of a book.
So when with the other SEALs, was there, whenever you're going through training and just everything that you had to do to become a SEAL, was there kind of history that was taught to you guys?
We had one. Let's see. It was a documentary that we watched. I can't remember what phase we watched it in, but I thought it was actually a pretty good documentary. It was. I don't recall how in depth it went into like the deep history of the of naval special warfare. I suspect it covered sort of the the wave top underwater demolition team history. It did a decent job of talking about the SEAL teams in Vietnam. It was good enough that when I started to work on this book, I spent a decent amount of time trying to track that documentary down. The only detail that I remembered from it was that it was that Tom Selleck had been the narrator.
You got to. I mean, that's important.
But
that's a formative thing.
Yeah, and I knew that Tom Selleck had, his the backstory of Magnum in Magnum PI. He had been a SEAL in Vietnam, so I remembered that.
That's a good point, because I actually forgot that point, and I usually don't forget anything about pop culture references, so I appreciate that.
Happy to help.
Yeah, I'm learning all kinds of things.
Were you able to track down the video?
Yeah, I found it eventually. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is how close or how they emphasized the relationship that the SEAL teams actually had with Ranger School, and how so many of the early SEALs went to the Army's Ranger School. So I thought that was one of the things that really jumped out for me when I was initially doing the research is the SEAL teams wouldn't have existed without Ranger School. So what the hell was Ranger School? Sure. How did Ranger School come about, and why weren't there Rangers?
And my point of reference with Ranger School is pretty much Apocalypse Now. I'm not any kind of a military historian by any means. I was listening to you on Jocko's podcast this morning, and you guys are going back and forth about basically telling tales, and he had a lot of points of reference because you guys came from the same sort of background, at least had the same sort of experience. But sure. I'm definitely not there. But I do appreciate the book. I like the fact that it's kind of a passion project for you, and you kind of delved into it and went deeper than pretty much anyone has before, I guess.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, I guess. The one I say the traits that make it possible to write a book like this are the same traits that make it hard to promote it.
Yeah, completely understand.
But
No.
I mean, once I kind of locked in on the topic, I mean, I always kind of knew that I was going to write a history book at some point. I grew up, really enthusiastic about it. I had a great family that was always, going to, historical places. And when I was in junior high, my grandpa started taking me to a Civil War battlefield every fall. So I grew up reading history, being interested in history, catching that enthusiasm from my family, and I just didn't have a topic. I never thought that I would turn it to this. And when I sat down to think about what if I was going to ever write a history book, the last thing I wanted to do was write a history book about the SEAL teams until I started digging into it. And then when I started digging into it, I was unfortunately all the same traits that get you through buds. Well, all those traits came back out, and I was obsessed, and really couldn't do anything else.
Well, in your book, you mentioned you started off in a desk in your kitchen with a couple note cards, and then it just evolved into several binders and books. And is that did you see it going that way where it would just? I mean,
I did.
No,
I had no idea what writing a book was like. I had an idea in my head of sort of a romantic idea of going into archives and digging through stacks and grabbing a sheet of paper here and a sheet of paper there, and then going back to like a coffee house and sitting down and quietly writing. Or that's not how you do it.
No, it's not. But you have to learn that out, right? Because you see that, and you've read about all the stories. So
it's much more mundane, much harder. I mean, you indescribably time consuming. When I sat down and I started writing that first chapter, I was sitting at my a little corner desk in our kitchen, and it was so tiny, and I had written out a few note cards and like what I thought was a decent. Actually, I hadn't even started using note cards at that point. I was using sheets of paper, and I had books that were I had tabbed through and everything, and I was doing the best I could, and really all I could do. My research was so disorganized, and I had so many books that I needed to use to write. The only place that I could write was at that kitchen table.
Right.
It wasn't until I got through that first chapter and realized there's got to be a much more efficient way to do this. And I hadn't even written the first chapter. I say that I'd written the first chapter. I'd written a first draft of the first chapter. I think my first chapter went through probably something like 14 separate drafts.
Holy shit.
I never stopped writing this book.
Right.
Francis Ford Coppola had a quote once that I really like. He said, "I never quit, or I never stopped working on a film. They just took them away from me."
Yeah.
And I worked on this book literally until the day the publisher said enough. And even then, I was still trying to claw it back from the publisher to fix this.
You got to cut it and let it out there into the world, because that's kind of the hardest part.
You have to. And that's one thing you have to do with research too. And I was okay with cutting off research, because research is really seductive. You want to keep going. You want to keep digging, because there's always more material. You've never gotten everything that you're going to get. But my basis was I would always keep a timeline, like a Word doc, when I was writing. And usually when I got to about 60 pages in a Word doc, I would know that I had a good enough timeline. And when I had about 3 to 4 inches of note cards, and note cards usually just quotes or very, very important information that I didn't want to get lost in a Word doc. Once I had about 3 to 4 inches of note cards, I knew I was ready to start. But even then, when you have about 3 inches of note cards, you're sick of research. You really don't want to do anymore. So you get rid of that for a second. You start writing. You write until you hit a wall, and you're like, I'm going in a direction I don't necessarily feel like this is taking me anywhere. And you got to go back to your research. So
Yeah.
You can start the research process again.
Yeah, because it
Yeah.
becomes kind of not a crutch, but it becomes something that, okay, I'm researching. Now I actually have to write the damn thing. I have to take all this research
Right.
and kind of construct something.
And you don't know what you're doing until you actually sit down to write. And I think a lot of people don't write because they never stop that researching. They just
exactly.
keep collecting, they keep collecting. They don't feel like they're ready to start writing. But, you have to start writing. I mean, this is unless you are working on a diary, you're trying to produce something that somebody else is going to read. You have a relationship with your reader. If you can picture that person or not, that person for me was me. I was writing for me. I was writing a book that I wanted to read, but nevertheless, I was imagining that I was, producing this for somebody else.
Sure.
Yeah. Did you ever get to a point where you got frustrated, wanted to quit, or like wonder if you were doing the right thing, or were you always pretty confident you were going in the right direction?
No. My default setting was I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I want to quit.
Yeah.
The human condition is that
that makes
default.
sense.
If they're honest with themselves, that is kind of the human condition. Is like, you learn all these things throughout your life, but in the end of it, you're like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right. You don't. I mean, I didn't know. I didn't know until I finished this book if the publisher was actually going to publish it. I thought they might sell the contract or just dump the contract, pay me back my advance. I had no idea. I knew that it was 100,000 words more than they had wanted in the contract. It was twice the length. It was twice the length than they had asked for, and I had 6 years over my deadline.
Yeah.
So I mean, they had. I mean, Random House was. They had more than enough reason to cancel the contract. So I mean, to their credit, they kept me around.
Did you? So I guess you had to. They wanted it shorter, but did you end up taking out stuff that, how does that whole like trimming down process? Was there stuff that you took out that you wanted to keep in there, or?
Yeah, there was. I mean, there was. And in every instance, my first reaction, to their suggested cuts was outrage.
Yeah, of course. That's my baby. You can't do that.
Yeah, I spent months researching this, and probably the worst one was what I thought was a really excellent description of the invasion at Dieppe, which is it's the Canadian, British and Canadian had conducted what was a sort of practice amphibious landing or practice assault onto continental Europe at the French port city of Dieppe. All of the lessons or all the problems that all the special operations units were created to solve, they occur at that battle. So I thought, well, in order to show why these units were created, I need to show all of these problems. And I found a lot of great material. I'd found what I thought was, stuff that had never been, discovered at the National Archive.
Yeah.
And I tried to, reduce all of that, research into, a solid 15-page introduction. And the publisher hated it. And ultimately, I got, I think, 2 sentences from those.
And when you look at
you
look at it now, do you think that it's stronger having cut all that, or do you still have your initial thing that was mine?
No, they were absolutely right.
That's right.
Absolutely right.
Like a lot of modern authors who get very successful, Stephen King comes to mind. He needs an editor sometimes because he sells so many copies now that he can just write whatever he wants, and his books suffer for it. So you said it took you 8 years to write this altogether?
Yeah, about a year and a half of sort of not casual research, but it was about a year and a half of trying to figure out what I was going to do and writing a proposal, writing that initial chapter. And then when I got the contract in, November of 2013, and I wrote, up until I wrote and wrote and wrote. And when I think I put in the initial, in the forward that it took 7 years to write.
Right.
It didn't. It's very long. Yeah, but I just wrote up until the end. In fact, I was writing, I was getting information. Particularly on Chapter 9, I just kept finding, great stuff. Chapter 9, Chapter 6. Chapter 6 was my China chapter, about the Navy in China, and then chapter 9 was my chapter about Arleigh Burke and the Bay of Pigs. And I kept finding folks to talk to, and I just kept wanting to, get that corroborative detail, somewhat jammed into the narrative.
No, speaking of the China chapter, that was probably the one that I found. I read through it probably the fastest. Just I think the character, or not character, but was it Mills?
Miles, yeah.
Miles, sorry.
No.
Yeah, I mean, what a character there. I'm surprised I've never heard of him before. Had you heard of him before?
I'd heard of him, but when I sat down to when I finished my UDT chapter, I was ready to move on to what I thought was going to be my OSS chapter, and I wasn't sure where that was going to be, but I had always thought, I really wanted to write about Donovan. I really wanted to write about Aaron Bank and the operational groups and the Jedburghs, and I knew that this Navy experience had happened in China. I knew vaguely about Mary Miles, and my thought was, I'm going to front load the introduction with a little bit of that information, and then I'll use that to launch into my OSS chapter. I researched all of my OSS stuff. I had the chapter ready to go. I had my 4 inches worth of note cards. I had an entire outline, and I started to try to write that introduction, about Mary Miles and Sacco and the Navy's experience in China, and I found that I couldn't even cram an introduction into 10 pages, and ultimately I was like, what the hell are you doing? This is the chapter, all of this stuff about China. So I went right back. I went back to the drawing board, and I went back to the National Archives. I found box upon box upon box that nobody had ever gone through, or at least that I couldn't. I saw no fingerprints of any other person having gone through this in the last 50 years.
Wow.
I've since come to find that there were, a couple of. There was a book written not terribly long ago. I think it was particularly very good. And then there have been a few academics who have been focused in on that, and hopefully they're doing great work on the material. But yeah, nobody. I mean, this is not. It's a completely forgotten corner of World War II. I mean, the Navy in China. I mean,
yeah.
What the hell is that?
That's what's so interesting about history in general. And I've of course, I don't have I didn't graduate with a degree in history, but I've always been a kind of an armchair historian kind of guy, and a surface level anyway. There's so many different stories and so many different details about almost any kind of conflict or any little thing. When you start digging into it, you could write, like you said, a 500 or 600 page book just on one incident that happened along the way. Easily.
And each one of these chapters could be its own book. That's how I sort of treated them along the way. I was just like, I'm just moving on to my next book. Like, when I started, I budgeted out 10 separate books. Unfortunately, it grew to 15, but
right.
I don't know how many extra years that accounted for. But when I got to that China chapter, that's when I realized I was not going to turn this book in any sort of timeline that the publisher would have liked. I got to the China chapter and I was like, I can't not write this chapter. It has to be in here. It's consequential to this entire story. I mean, if you tried to write origin story of naval special warfare, you couldn't. You'd be dishonest if you left this out.
No, it's interesting. So I know along the way you were going to the archives and stuff like that, and you also mentioned that you met some family members of some of these guys before or along the way.
Yeah, the trick in writing the book was always to try and figure out which operation was going to move the story forward, or which mission or which operation was going to, add that next brick, to the house that was ultimately going to build the entire structure, or whatever metaphor you want to. I knew where my start point was, and I knew where my end point was in the book. I knew my end point was in Vietnam. I knew my start point was at Bacon Island. Everything else, I sort of had to figure out along the way. So in each instance, I was just trying to, kind of hopscotch from, one event to the other to see how I could connect these 2 points. So once I decided on what the operation or the mission was going to be, then I would try and find that one person, the most consequential person, to the either success or failure of that operation, and how that success or failure pushed the story forward. And so I would read as much as I could, anything that had been published about that person, about that event, and then I would go to the archives and I would dig into the actual operations, and 9 times out of 10 I would find the fingerprints of that consequential person all over those documents. But even then, oftentimes that wasn't enough, because you might get a sense of a person by reading their mail. You're going to kind of get a sense of the words that they use, the language that they use, a bit of their personality, whether they're aggressive or reticent or all this stuff. But you don't really know the person until you talk to people that actually knew them. So once I kind of hit that wall in each instance, I would always try and contact either folks that knew him or family members, and usually those family members of those folks would lead me down another rabbit hole full of letters and other documents. But yeah, absolutely made great friends along the way. It's probably the one bright spot in this whole experience. I mean, writing is hard, researching is hard, but getting to know the family members of the people that you're writing about, that was an absolute pleasure.
Did they have a sense of like how important those family members were, or
sometimes
were they kind of surprised?
I mean, if you so Kelsey Kaufman was was the daughter of Draper Kaufman, and Kelsey, and her brother grew up, knowing that their dad was not even a minor celebrity, just a full blown Navy celebrity. So they knew, and when I contacted them, they were all but too happy to talk and open up their homes for me to come in and dig through their closets. But they had a sense. But 9 times out of 10, Buck Halpern's son, Dan Halpern, he knew that his dad was special, and he had an incredible relationship with his dad. But I don't think Dan had any idea how consequential his dad was to this history. Or somebody like Martin Watson, his son Martin Watson. I mean, Martin Watson was a corporal in the Korean War. I mean, how consequential can a corporal be? So he had an idea that his dad had been this comic book proportion hero, but he had no idea how important he was. Bob Wagner, Bob Wagner's son, Mike Wagner. Like I could have written a book just about Bob Wagner. The problem, some of these guys, trying to just like cram their story into the narrative so it can push you forward, but there's enough there for multiple books.
Yeah, it's kind of like in high school with Alexander the Great. You spend 3 pages on Alexander the Great, then you move on to the next guy. And you dip your toe in, but what you're doing here is a really deep dive. And one thing I did want to ask you is, of course, the SEALs are iconic, right? They're known worldwide. There's documentaries and all that stuff. How much of the person you are today is tied up into still being that? Because you did it for so long, and because they're so iconic.
You broke up just at the tail end of the question. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just saying, how much of your identity, from the person that you are today, is tied up in what you did in being a SEAL because they're so iconic? Oh gosh,
the SEAL teams, they make a person. I mean, Buds does 2 things. I mean, it reveals your character to yourself, but it also improves your character. I mean, you're not just Buds doesn't just find people that can be SEALs. It makes SEALs. You have to become that, and there's a lot of lessons that you learn along the way, and that you're going to carry through the rest of your life. So I mean, it'd be difficult to disentangle the 2.
Sure.
Now,
how much of that is just the actual physical part of Buds, the crucible where it kind of breaks you down? How much of that? I mean, I know you can't put a percentage point on it, but how important?
I don't know. I had a friend once who was giving a presentation to a room full of aircraft carrier sailors, and he was trying to describe Buds, and he said, Buds is 100% physical and it's 100% mental.
Sure.
He wasn't the best in math.
Right. I understand that. Of course, I haven't done it, but I do understand what you're saying. I
mean, it's Buds has a way of
Once you go through that door, you're in that room, and you're there for the rest of your life.
Well, yeah, it has a good way of revealing what your priorities are. Like I don't mean the priorities that you're going to have throughout your life, but they reveal the priorities that you have at that moment that you're attending that school, and it's a school, but it's a very hard school. And when you wake up Monday morning and you realize after you've had the weekend to think about it. You wake up Monday morning and you realize, well, this is probably the last moment of the week that I'm going to be, dry and not be physically, miserable just from chafing in every crevice of my body.
Sure.
And it's difficult to get out of bed. So I remember one morning, it was the second week. This is probably a week before Hell Week starts. It was the first day of the second week of training. There was a college or one of the top swimmers in my BUD/S class had been one of the top swimmers in California. He had come into the Navy on the buddy program, which allowed you to join the Navy with your friend and then go through boot camp together and then start BUD/S together.
Sure.
So I remember standing there. He was in my boat crew, and he looks at his buddy who he's gone through high school with, boot camp with, pre-BUD/S with, and now he's in the first, sort of second week of BUD/S with, and he's in the same boat crew with this kid. And he looks over at him and he says, "Hey man, I'm quitting." And his buddy, suddenly ashen-faced, he doesn't know what to say. He's speechless. And he says, "Well, why?" And he says, "Well, I want to have a family." And he just starts walking off toward the bell. He gets about 50 yards away.
Wow.
And the buddy who's still with us, he suddenly comes to his senses and he goes, "Dude, you don't even have a girlfriend."
Exactly. I can understand being in that point. It's like, I could really settle down with some kids right now, get a nice white picket fence instead of doing all this.
Right.
Right. That white picket fence does become sort of an inviting thing when you're in hell.
Yeah, but the thing about BUD/S that it's different than boot camp, because boot camp is terrible. Nobody likes boot camp. But the one thing that is different about one of these special operations programs is you have an option to leave. It's not the end of the world. You can go to the regular fleet. There's another option for you. I mean, if you weren't allowed to quit BUD/S, you'd have a lot more people that got through. But because there's it's a volunteer program, the ability to volunteer yourself out is very compelling to some. So.
Did you have any moments where you almost walked away from it, or?
There was a moment right the first night of Hell Week. It was really cold. I was like, I just don't know how I'm going to do this for the next 5 days. And the skipper, the director of training, he was walking down the line of students after a surf torture, and he was just looking at guys, and he was just saying, "You can do this." And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but I was like, he's right. And then that's the last time I thought about it.
Yeah, and like I said, I've never been in any kind of thing like that, even close. But what I always when something was difficult in my life, when I looked at the person who was instructing me on it or telling me about it, and I realized that they went through it and they were capable of it, I always had that kind of like, well, if that guy can do it, I maybe can probably do that as well. So I could definitely see how that was him.
My grandpa, who was an Okinawa Marine, and then he had, when the Battle of Okinawa had ended and they needed underwater demolition swimmers, he had volunteered to go, be a Marine frogman. So he had gone through 3 weeks of UDT training on Okinawa, and he knew that I was going through this. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got before I went to BUD/S was, he said, if it ever gets hard, just look around, and if you see somebody that's going through it that you think looks dumber than you, and he can do it,
exactly.
You probably can't do it.
So been my life mantra that's kind of got me through as well, just to a lesser degree than yourself, sir. But yeah, it's definitely some powerful thing.
I would always there was one kid that I would always lean up. If I was in surf torture or anything, I'd peek up. Man, he's still here.
I can't let that guy beat me.
I guess I can do it.
Yeah. Battling mediocrity has always kind of been my my best thing too. If I can just be better than the worst guy, that's what I'm going for. It's worked out well so far.
Right. I definitely wasn't a super BUD/S student. Or
but you're a SEAL. That's pretty decent. That That looks pretty good on a
Yeah,
resume.
that's fine.
Yeah, and how was your service? You spent some time in Iraq. Did you go anywhere else?
Yeah, I had Europe and Africa, and then Iraq. So I had a good mix. When I was working on the book, one of the things that I kind of helped me, whenever I was thinking about a battle or thinking about these guys going through the surf or doing the hydrographic reconnaissance that they were doing, or the underwater demolition, or leading guerrillas, or conducting a raid or something like that. I'd done everything. I'd done all those things at one point. I had done a real world hydrographic reconnaissance in Liberia. I'd gotten slammed against rocks. I'd gotten tangled up in my lead line. And all of that stuff. I mean, I knew what it was like to be on the the wrong end of a gunfight. I mean, all of that little stuff. It informs your writing. You're able to draw from a reservoir of experience that I don't know if every historian is able to do it. I'm not sure I'm confident calling myself a historian, but I think that you get to a point if you're writing. I don't know. We can come back to that in a second, but you do get to a point if you're writing where you have all the information that you're going to have. There's no way you can drill any deeper into the material. Everybody who's been involved in the operation that you are writing about, you've either talked to or they're dead. There's no more documents that you're going to find, and so you have to rely on that sixth sense, if you will, or that your own imagination. What did it? And you got to think, like, what did it feel like? What did it smell like? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? And if you have some of that, and I'm not saying that you take those experiences and you overlay them or anything like that, not in a dishonest way, but you have to be able to fill in the gaps in your own research, in your own material.
Do you see that? So I know, at the beginning of your book when we were talking about the story with your grandmother, do you see the SEALs possibly using your book to kind of be an intro for people in the future, or is it, I guess, too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. It would be flattering. I mean, I hope that the teams are getting something out of it. I don't know what. The guys that came together to help get this book into the hands of Admiral McRaven, they're very enthusiastic about it, and I've made it's just incredibly generous and kind guys that have found the value in it and that are trying to get this out into the community. I can't tell you what the reaction in the community is going to be. I can tell you that I wrote this for the community. Like this was me. The teams have given me everything. So I mean, they shaped and created the person that I am today and made it possible to do this. And I feel like that this was the least I
would say, just judging by the amount of passion and dedication you put into it. I mean, you put almost a quarter of your life into making this thing. That probably this is going to pretty much be the most well-researched thing on the Navy SEALs, and they're probably going to take this into account going forward. I'm no Nostradamus here, but
well, I hadn't thought that it was a quarter of my life. But thanks for
I'm terrible about that. I knew that would make you cringe a bit. I always like to think about that when I think about like half my life was spent doing one thing. Is like half. Oh my, half. Okay. Yeah. All right. Moving forward. Yes. For what little bit of forward we got left.
Yeah. Well said, though.
Yeah. No, one thing that stood out to me is, the SEALs have been around since I've been on this earth. But when you read this book, I mean, they could have easily not ever happened. I mean, it was either, they had a few different attempts. I don't know if I'm saying that the right way. And some were disbanded. The Army was around, the Marines were around, and it was kind of their playing field, and they just never really filled that gap. It's amazing that it could have easily never happened. The SEALs could have easily never been around.
Yeah, one of the subtitles that I played with a bunch when I was trying to come up with a name for this book was, the By Water Beneath the Walls, the origin story of the Navy SEALs, comma, a unit that should not exist. Something like that.
Real catchy
It was
thing, right off the
too
top.
long,
Yeah.
too clunky.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But I mean, but you're right. I mean, there was the title that I gave the book when I drafted the proposal was The Evolution, and the evolution to me was meant to like, it was a metaphor to kind of talk about this drastic transformation from a maritime environment to a land environment. But the more I thought about it, like the more I thought of what evolution is, and evolution is sort of inevitable,
Sure.
mindless, haphazard in some ways. There was nothing haphazard. There was nothing inevitable about the story. This was decisive. I mean, this was Army, Marine Corps, CIA planners and leaders that were decisively turning their back on this mission, time and time again, and not for villainous reasons or anything like that. They had different priorities, and they defined their relevance or the relevance of their service in a different way. But each time they did this, the unintended consequence was they left this gap time and time again. And it's not to say that because that gap exists that someone's going to move into it, but for because of the Navy's bias toward toward offensive warfare, and because of the leaders that the Navy had, it's at specific moments in their history, that gap was repeatedly filled time and time and again, and pushed further and further away from the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, absolutely. There's nothing inevitable about the story. It was all not, and it was an accident. It was not an accident. It was an intention. It was intentional. If this was a crime, if this was a murder, it was first degree.
Which is interesting because a lot of these guys that you're highlighting in this book, at the time when they were in these situations, probably had no idea what this would ever lead to. And looking back on it, now they can be kind of honored for that. But at the time, they just, hey, I've been assigned to do this. Here I am, and I'm doing it. And it was either disbanded or whatever. And now that everything has moved in that direction, SEALs have been around for a long time. It's nice that they're getting to be honored like that. So that's really good.
No, you're right though. If you pluck one of the characters out from the early years, or even in the early days of the SEAL teams, nobody knew what this was ultimately going to become. I mean, nobody could have predicted,
Right.
the level of maturity that naval special warfare would eventually, achieve. And nobody had plans to create this, this organization. One thing that I thought was interesting along the way is that each time the Marine Corps or the Army decided to take this mission on or create a unit like this, there was each person, whether it was Evans Carlson or John McGee or Bill Darby, they had this this ability to sort of build these castles in their head, to create an organization, at least in their mind, that would be the sort of commando entity that we are kind of familiar with today. They knew that it needed to be that each of these units needed to be strategic, that they shouldn't be just left to divisional misuse, that the guys should be trained specially, and that they should be kept from infantry duties or more mundane activities. The Navy didn't know any of that, and every time the Navy creates one of these units, they might create them decisively, but they didn't have any grand plans or anything like that. They just continued to solve individual problems, whether that problem was the fact that Kelly Turner didn't have reconnaissance troops because Hal and Mad Smith wouldn't let him use the back recon company, or whether they needed to establish weather stations in China, or because they needed to destroy obstacles in Normandy, or because they had there were too many rocket launches coming out of the Rungsat Special Zone. I mean, each instance they were trying to solve a specific or particular problem. Where it wasn't like an entrepreneurial effort like it often seemed to be in the Army and the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And because they were solving individual problems, and because they weren't just like sort of speculating, I think that they had more of the justification for survival, if you will.
Yeah.
And now look at it.
No, that makes
because
sense.
the SEALs today, I mean, if you ask a kid on the street who the SEALs are, they can tell you. But if you ask them who Delta Force or the Rangers, they've kind of taken a back seat, at least on the publicity, to the SEALs over the last 2 decades, I would say.
That's true. That won't last either. I mean, everybody's going
There's
to,
cycles for
in the
everything.
next, and then, yeah, there will be, and it's not. I never wanted to say that the SEAL teams were better than anybody. There have been books that have been published that have absurd subtitles like the SEAL teams are the most elite unit in the history of the planet or some ridiculous thing like that. I never wanted to
sell
say
some
that.
copies,
I mean,
man.
all of the units that.
They're trying to sell
Sorry?
some copies, man. Aren't we all?
Yeah, they are. I mean, yes, of course they're trying to sell some copies, but I mean, the efforts that the Green Berets, the Rangers, the Delta Force, PJs, the Marine Corps Raiders. I mean, they're when the history of this period is finally written in 20 years, when everything is declassified. I mean, you're going to see a much fuller picture. The SEALs have just been one element, an important element, absolutely. I mean. I mean, the SEAL teams have the contribution is undeniable. I mean, not only do you have were SEALs responsible for the the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, but 3 months, 4 days later, they were a participant in the worst tragedy in the entire war in Afghanistan.
I do remember that. Yes.
I mean, they have been yes. I mean, they've been critical to all of this, but you can't forget that in each of those instances, it hasn't just been SEALs that are doing it. I mean, Rangers lots of folks have supported the SEALs over the years. I mean, Green Berets, they led the assault into Afghanistan on horseback, unsupported and alone. Delta Force.
That's
I mean, how
awesome.
many missions has Delta Force included that we don't even know about?
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting though is I mean those Army and Marine Corps and CIA units, they're doing exactly what we expect them to do. I mean, they're in the environments that we expect them to be in. I think what makes the SEALs so interesting and so just weird is that they're sailors. I mean, they're sailor commandos, and they're operating in places that we don't expect sailor commandos to operate, and they're doing it at such a high level that that they're serving alongside Rangers and Green Berets and Delta Force.
Well, to be fair, we have been operating.
It is a remarkable story.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to be fair, we've been operating in deserts for the last 20 years, or 30 now.
True, you're right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But what's interesting to me is that the SEALs have always been. I mean, nobody blinked when SEALs started operating in those environments. Just like, yeah, of course they're gonna, we're gonna use SEALs here. SEALs, do this kind of mission. I mean, why wouldn't we want to? And the only reason I think that SEALs have been used in those capacities is because the groundwork has been built, or the expectations have been built. Whether the expectations were built in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, or through all of the minor skirmish wars that they fought in the interwar period.
Yeah, and you touched on it a little bit with, I guess, what's Afghanistan and the last 20, 30 years and so on. How do you see, maybe not just the SEALs, but just as a historian, when you look back at the last 20 years, you see what's kind of happened in Afghanistan the last few months. What's your take on everything?
Yeah, that's a big take.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think everybody's a bit raw right now from everything that they've seen, and I didn't serve in Afghanistan, so I don't have a personal connection to the events that were happening there as I do say like in Iraq or something like that. But Afghanistan has always been since the war has started, it's been the theater. It's been the one critical theater that has been there the entire time, and now to see that come to a close, I mean, there's a lot to think about, and I think it's going to provide an opportunity, for us to sort of reassess. I mean, after Vietnam, there's a lot of people calling for the resignation of generals, or the resignation of Biden, or things like that. I mean, if we demanded the resignation of generals and presidents after every lost war. We wouldn't have any generals since Kennedy, or we wouldn't have any presidents since Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy abandoned our Cuban allies. We've abandoned allies, at various stages ever since. The South Vietnamese. We've abandoned the Kurds. We've got. We have a list of disappointments, but I think I think what I've learned from writing this book is that there were structures in place at each phase or in each of the services at every period that I was writing about that were problematic, that leaders identified after major combat operations had stopped. Whether the one that always sticks in my head is the Army's policy, or the U.S. military's policy, of individual rotation in the Vietnam War, and how they were trying to save money by not rotate entire units back home. It was terribly costly to do that, so they were trying to keep units in the field and then just backfill them with individual augmentees, and they just leave these units in the field, and guys would serve for a year. But the problem in that structure was that these units, they never really trained together. Mm-hmm. They never really developed into a cohesive unit. And
sure.
Guys, it took a long time for guys to feel any sort of camaraderie with the guys that they were working with, or any trust in the battlefield with the guys that they were working with. And that wasn't just regular infantry units. That was that was with Army Special Forces. They were having the same problems. And one of the reasons that the SEAL teams did so well in Vietnam is because they never did that. They deployed as a team. They deployed back home as a team. They trained together. They knew each other. They knew what each other looked like in the dark. They were ready to die for each other because they knew each other. They knew each other's families. So what? My question now that now the Afghanistan is over, now we're going to turn our attention, to what happened. I don't think we should be, wielding torches or anything like that. But I think we should, go into this. Where were the breakdowns? Communicating to policymakers what the military could do. What resources it would require to actually accomplish that mission, and why we failed, why policymakers wouldn't do that, or why generals weren't willing to advocate for that, and then short of winning those resources, why they weren't advocating for an immediate pullout or something like that. I'm not sure that that's what happened. I don't know, and it's going to take a long time for us to know what happened. Declassification is going to take probably 25 years until we're going to be able to read through the emails, and it's not going to be until then that we can really point fingers. I think we just need to come at this with a little bit more humility.
Well, I mean, you talked about, like, if we got rid of any leader or any kind of general that made these kind of mistakes, we wouldn't have any left. But maybe that, just speaking from the other side of it, maybe you can back engineer that and say that if you made those mistakes constantly, and it just seems to be a repeating pattern, maybe the job of, and I'm not saying your job, but the job of a historian is kind of to look at history and then see it repeating, and then see what you can do to not do that again. But it seems like with the way that our military is,
you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't. Generals aren't historians. Generals are. They've got a different job, and they've got, depending on what kind of general they are. I mean, they're focused, on operations. But I think, once you are no longer focused on actual operations, if you're in a leadership position, you should be spending at least 50% of your time constantly assessing your own institution, the procedures, your priorities, your culture. And if you're not doing that, you're doing something wrong. That's just my take. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how much.
No, I mean, you could talk about this kind of subject for, just like with your book. You can go deep into the weeds as you want, going back as far as you'd like, and go through all the different, twists and turns. I mean, we're definitely not trying to put you on the spot. We're just trying to get your overview of it. We completely understand what you're saying.
One question I had was, so whenever we left Iraq, for example, did you know, any of the interpreters or any of the people that helped us that maybe, are kind of in similar situations that you're seeing in Afghanistan? Maybe they're wanting to leave, or I guess the pullout was a little bit different from Iraq.
I think it was quite a bit different in Iraq. There was no, outside of the north, the ISIS didn't have, nearly the capabilities to do what they did. But no, I didn't have any, personal connection to any interpreter that I was, desperate to get out. But I have had friends that have been, engaged in trying to get, guys that they knew out of there, and it is an absolutely desperate and it's tragic.
I guess just another question on it. I know that there's been a lot said about kind of the guys who served over there and them really having a hard time, with this, just kind of, the pullout and everything like that. Have you, some of your, the SEALs that you worked with, are they, or just other people that served, are you seeing the same thing? Just people having a hard time with just how to make sense of it all?
To some degree. I don't know. I think I think everybody's kind of gotten used to, whether or not it's disappointment or, we've kind of come around to the idea that none of this was
I kind of think that like a lot of operators or a lot of people who do a certain job, once you get in that job and you've been doing it, it doesn't matter what the boss says. You kind of know what it's like on the ground. So the end of the shit show is going to be a shit show. And you're just doing the best job that you can along the way. And I don't know, that's kind of what I look at this. And kind of try to put myself in the perspective of the people on the ground. Maybe you have hopes, but in your mind, you kind of know what the day-to-day life is like. I got one thing, David. I got to ask him this. We were just talking the other day about he just asked me on the spot, what's my top 5 favorite action movies? And 4 of the 5 were military movies, because I'm a movie guy. And you may not be, Ben. You may not even want to answer this question. But in your opinion, 1 or 2 top military or action movies of all time? And I have to ask this question. I have to.
Oh, that's easy. It's always, for a war movie or action movie, it's always going to be a toss-up for me between Last of the Mohicans and Master and Commander.
Damn it. Mm-hmm. See, I told you I left Last of the Mohicans off that list. I knew I should have put that in there. I don't know what I was thinking the other day. Black Hawk Down? Are you out of your mind? I don't know what the problem was, Dave. I'll never let myself live that down. But yes, Last of the Mohicans.
Well, lately I've been hooked on. I find myself rewatching Lincoln a lot and Moneyball.
Yeah, I like Moneyball.
Moneyball. Oh, such a great movie.
I haven't watched that forever. Man, this is going down a path I can get on board.
I'm a big movie. I don't watch a lot of sports, but I do.
Hey, it's like that's my new co-host, David.
That's right. Yeah, Mike's a big movie. He's a big movie buff, and I haven't seen almost anything. I just watched. I'm halfway through Rocky 3 right now, so.
Right.
I do love the fact that he's stuck on Rocky.
Yeah,
Rocky 3. I told him Rocky 4 is the best. We're fighting the commies, man.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Easily the best. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, Ben. We really do appreciate your time. Mike, did you have any other questions before we sign off?
Man, we could do this all night, but unfortunately, I got to do some stuff with the children here shortly. Ben, I wish you great success with this book you got out there, man. I really do. I hope it does well for you.
Thank you, Mike.
We appreciate the time that you've given us.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Anytime. I'll see you guys when I do the next one in 10 years.
There awesome. You go. I like it.
Good to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Nice to talk to you, David. Thank you, Mike. All right, bye.
No top hits, neighbors think it's obnoxious. I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson, but damn, you gon' have to wait until the drop hits. I forgot to take my vitamins, but didn't forget to smoke.